Hey, so here I am. I'm going to talk about Game of Thrones. I've seen this show about 4 times in its entirety since it aired. I want to be straight up and be honest. I did not watch, I'm sorry, I did not read the books. So do not take any of this as book criticism. If you're a book fan, I'm not criticizing the books. I haven't read them. I'm focusing on the showrunners, and George R. R. Martin's involvement in the show, and not focusing in any way, shape, or form on the books. Again, I did not read the books. I want to first say that I love the first 5 seasons of the show. I did not like the last 3. And having said that, as a story, the show, and as a filmmaker and as a screenwriter myself, I thought that the screenwriting for the show as it went on became not only weaker, but tropey and inconsistent. But something I realized recently, and this is the topic of this video, so if you're still watching, thank you. If you cut off and not watching, I totally understand. So, my theory or my thesis here is that I believe the show of Game of Thrones and possibly the book, and if you've read the book, please comment in the comments below and tell me where I'm off, where I'm on. But my view is that George R. R. Martin and the showrunners set off to basically give the middle finger to fantasy readers and not readers, I apologize, fantasy viewers. I believe that this show's sole purpose was to basically circumvent and to go against what we were feeling, what we thought we'd get, right? I think that there's a sort of a nihilistic approach to this story, and a nihilistic approach in that I think that the show itself and the story it's telling is purposefully trying to piss us off as an audience. I give you a few examples. Now, having rewatched it just recently, I noticed that there's a lot of moments where characters make really stupid decisions. Now, not to say they're stupid decisions out of their character's sort of realm of reality, but there's decisions made that I believe are set in motion in order to circumvent what we think is going to happen, and to purposefully irritate us as a character gets killed or a character goes down a path. And however you want to see it, I believe that this is intentional to sort of create a nomer within the fan base that's watching the show that, oh, I'm so pissed off. The Red Wedding being, obviously the most famous of all. The Red Wedding happened and everyone lost their shit. And it was a great event in television history. I loved every minute of it. But if you look back on it and you look back on the decisions made and all the different stuff, there's multiple times. I get another example I had was Arya. When she's in Harrenhal, she gets to kill 3 people. And of course, through the series of events, that one of those 3 people isn't Tywin Lannister. If she kills Tywin Lannister at that point, the story's over. At least the general story. In terms of Stannis sacks the kingdom, Stannis becomes the king, and your story goes in a different direction. Albeit, not a bad direction, actually, because it's a whole new story with Stannis taking the lead. But I believe that, I struggle with the overall writing and the story that's told throughout the show, because I think that as much as it's sort of going against tropes and all that stuff, especially in the first 5 seasons, at the end of the day, it's going against those tropes and those conventions to really just thumb their nose at sort of the Lord of the Rings type fan base. I think that the showrunners and probably George R. R. Martin to an extent, like I said, I haven't read the book, so you can tell me if I'm way off base here. But I believe George R. R. Martin set out I mean, the people who wrote the Dan and Dave who wrote the show with the help of George R. R. Martin basically set out to say, I'm going to tell a story that's going to annihilate the sort of conventions of this genre. But I don't think, I think there's two ways to do that. One way is to annihilate those genre, to annihilate the sort of cliches of the genre, or like the tropes or all these things, which by the way are tried and true and work, right? That's why we love these stories, Lord of the Rings and so on and so forth. But I believe it's sort of a purposeful attempt at contempt for the audience, or really the genre. To me, I think it's a contempt for the genre of fantasy. I think this story actually is basically, might as well be a scary movie, if that makes sense. A scary movie is making fun of horror tropes. So the movie itself is built on the idea that horror tropes are silly and stupid, and so we made this comedy movie in order to show you how silly and stupid they are. I believe that's what this show actually is in disguise. I think this show is basically a very serious version of a scary movie for the fantasy world. I think it's there to sort of the story thumbs its nose at those who just like watching, the classic story of good fighting evil and all these kind of things. And I think fantasy as a genre lives in that world. So does Western, so do a lot of these kind of things. Not to say there can't be gray areas, and of course there's always gray areas in every type of genre and storytelling. But fantasy lives in a realm that isn't real in its nature. Whereas the Western lives in some level of reality, right? There was a Western society back in the 1800s. So to create a fantasy world and to give it a lot of the sort of reality human things, which is jealousy, greed, all the things that happen in this show that, yes, would happen in real life to a degree. But I think that in the case of the Starks, I think that it happens in this show at such a violent flurry and such an intensity that I think that it's really to draw us into it and then to piss us off and to make us upset and sad that our beloved characters are getting massacred one by one. And you finally have the two major things where the story wraps up in season 6, 7, and 8, which is the rest of the Stark clan who's alive and Daenerys. On one hand, the rest of the Stark clan that's alive pretty much don't get their story finished in the way you would assume it would, right? Arya kills Cersei in a violent, horrible knifing or something, and so on and so on. But instead, we get this, the Starks sort of have this kind of like whimper of a story ending. Bran is the king. He doesn't even want to be the king. Jon is killed, okay. And Sansa is the queen of the North or something. You know what I mean? We get this, and I think that's on purpose. I think it's to say, screw you, you're not getting what you want. And I think it's akin to going to a basketball game and the entire starting lineup isn't playing. LeBron James isn't playing, and neither are the other Luka Doncic. No one's playing. Or you go to a basketball game and they play football. That's what this show is. And I'm all for, pushing against tropes and all those kind of things. I really do appreciate that stuff. And there are some great stuff in the show. Don't get me wrong. I just think that at the end of the day, the show is meant to be subversive to the genre. It doesn't like the genre. It hates the tropes of the genre. And again, as an artist, that's fine. But I think the show, if you see it through that lens, the show actually does bad writing just in the same way that that the fantasy novels and movies of the past did in the other way with the tropes. So this one's anti-tropey to be anti-tropey. Finally, Daenerys' storyline. It doesn't make anyone happy. Again, I'm not going to beat the dead horse. It's the same concept. At the end of the day, Daenerys lets us down because we're supposed to be let down. The writer and the filmmakers and the show creators, they are purposely letting us down. That's literally the context of the show. So anyone who was mad at the ending and thought it was terrible, they missed the point of the entire show. Anyway, that's my thoughts. Tell me how stupid I am and how much of an asshole I am and all those wonderful things in the comments. I really, really would love to hear what book readers think of what I'm saying. Peace.